The other speaker will be Sander van der Leeuw. Oh, yeah, this is him. He is an archaeologist, an historian by training, and has studied ancient technologies, ancient and modern men, land relationships, and complex systems theory. That's only a very small part of what these guys did. They did a lot more, but it's not my talk, it's their talk. Sander is an expert when it comes to the role of invention, sustainability, and innovation in societies around the world. Sander is Dutch, so am I, but has lived a large part of his life outside the Netherlands. I think because it maybe have been too small for him, that little country. Anyway.
With Brian, that I know many of you, but I've been here now 4 or 5 times, and I've always tremendously enjoyed the intellectual climate that you have here. And so it's for me a great honor and a great pleasure to actually be here on this occasion and to try and convey to you some of the ideas that I have about innovation. Now, the title of this thing is a little bit of irony, because what I'm going to be trying to do is to focus on about 1 million years, but do it in 45 minutes. So we will see if I manage that, but that is the purpose, and Brian and I have talked quite a bit about this topic together, and that has been very, very pleasant. So let me see where I can get. And I'm starting with similar images as he does, but I show you here that I go back a lot further. I start at about 600,000 years ago, when some people say humans actually invented fire. And I end up here with all the technologies that I actually lived through and in many ways personally experienced in my lifetime. But what I'm trying to do here is, and that is where Brian's talk is a really hard act to follow, and don't expect me to be so entertaining and so artful, because I am not looking at the proximate explanations, at the history. As an archaeologist, I have to find explanations for many different cultures. I cannot focus on one. I have to find explanations that work for very primitive hunter-gatherer people, like the ones that created the fire, as well as for the very sophisticated people that I have sitting here in front of me. So this is a bit of a different charge. And that is what I'm going back here, okay. So one of the things that is here as a starting point is that very, very many people for a long time have argued that we distinguish ourselves as human beings from animals because we learn. I think that's no longer the case. I think we have in many animal worlds animals who actually learn. I think what is typical for human beings, though, is that they organize, and they can organize themselves in different ways. They can devise abstract, communicable symbols in writing or in language. They can learn how to learn, and they can accumulate learning, which is part of the process that Brian has showed us over the long-term time. They can organize themselves, and they organize their ideas and their environment. And another thing that is really interesting, which I don't know of animals doing, is they experiment, they plan, they design. And so what I think is one of the basic points that I want to make is that whereas in many societies and in many scientific fields, we have used sort of an approach where we have distinguished individuals and populations. I would argue we need to do something else. We actually need to look at organizations and how people organize themselves. And so one of the underlying trends that I'm going to be talking about is the evolution of organization in very many different fields. Now, what is this organization all about? This organization is about how we as human beings process information. We have only one interface with the outside world, which is our cognition. And we have behind that a brain that can use the signals from the cognition in very many different ways. And so what I am doing here is, because I am looking for an ultimate explanation for many cultures and many societies, I am taking information processing as the core thing that I need to study. No, I really have to learn this. Okay, ultimate, not proximate explanation. There are in every society many factors that create social change, that create technologies, that create innovation. Sometimes it's very clear to see, sometimes it's not. I worked for a while in the uplands of Papua New Guinea, and I had one village where people had invented a very interesting technology, which was to take a split bamboo and to make it into a pair of pincers so they could get their hot potatoes, sweet potatoes, out of the fire in the morning. The next village didn't have that. They burnt their feet and their fingers all the time. So the question became, why? Why did one adopt and the other did not adopt? So basically, what I'm going to look at here is the relationship that keeps us as a society functioning. And I would argue that that is the relationship between three different flows through our society. Those of matter, energy, and information. Of those three, matter and energy are not things that we can simply share at a social scale. And so information is the one that we actually share, that we participate in. That is what creates our culture, our way of doing things. And I would argue that those three flows interact in an interesting way, in the sense that we need the energy and the resources as individuals to live, and we have the information processing to actually create ways in which we can gather that energy and those resources. And so, from my point of perspective, I would argue that it is the information processing that keeps our societies together, and therefore is a very fundamental part of our functioning. Because as individuals in the natural world, most of us would not survive. And that goes back a very, very long time. Again, going back to New Guinea, one of the biggest fears of somebody in a society there is to be expelled from the society for making a mistake. Because at that point, that person is alone. And alone, it is very, very difficult to survive. So what they'll try and do is go and join another tribe, but that is very difficult. So without information processing, I would argue that a society falls apart, that it dissipates. Now, before I go on about those basic dynamics, I need to make a distinction here between invention and innovation. And I do that in one way, and there are other ways to do it. But basically, invention, to my mind, is the act of elaborating a novel idea. That can be a technical idea, but we have, after this talk about technology, also to bring to the fore a number of other elements. That can be a social idea. It can be an idea about a process. It can be an idea about institutions. It can be an idea about just about anything. And it can be, and very often, is actually first launched by one or a small number of individuals. And I am not saying that they do not, as Brian has just argued, depend on all the people that went before them. So they're operating in a network, but they're a node in a network that comes up with this recombination of things that is something novel. An important part of that is that in that process, that group or that person has a limited set of ideas. And that when that invention is then brought into the wider society, there's two things that happen. On the one hand, as you argued a number of times, the society has to change its behavior, and that is incredibly costly in energy. And the other thing that happens at that particular point is that, this is difficult to explain, but many new people who get to look at the invention are actually seeing different things in it. And so what you get is a situation where this thing is launched, and then all kinds of other functions are found for it. And that is what helps spread it in the wider society. Now, I want to emphasize this point that we're not only talking about artifacts. Information processing tools, under that I understand all the tools for thought. Whether it's code, whether it's language, ideas, customs, and all those kinds of things. But to create them, the information has to be processed, which is invention. And then the interesting thing is, once that has been done, those things facilitate the information processing itself. So the tool for thought, whether it's expressed in a material form, like a hammer, or any other kind of tool, has on the one hand been created by information processing, but then it also helps information processing because it allows us to combine in an object a whole set of functions that we then don't have to think about anymore, about how to do. So what I'm basically arguing, and that goes back to Brian's talk again, is that artifacts are substantiated tools for thought. And that I am going to focus, therefore, in the rest of my talk, on the tools for thought element without so much the material element that Brian has been talking about. And I would argue that it's those things, and he has made that point, I think, in a very beautiful way, that these inventions, once they turn into innovations, are actually what shapes the history of humankind. Now, I'm going to take very, very large steps through all of this and skip a lot, otherwise I wouldn't be in my 45 minutes. But I think you can distinguish in the history of human information processing the 6 stages that are actually on the screen here. I will talk a little bit about the first one, which is basically the evolution of our brain. And that is why I start about 1 million years ago, or give or take a few 100,000, because archaeologists are not very precise on dates, and I'm even less so. I couldn't do anything that you did, Brian, about sort of 1786 or something like that. No way. No way. But in that first period, we are limited in our information processing. And that is why it takes us a very long time to lay the basis for the kinds of thought systems, tools for thought, that we then actually use worldwide. And so that is this stage 1. Then, in the second stage, communication comes in. And rather than sort of have very scarce communications, we begin to communicate much more with each other. And because of that, we exchange ideas, we exchange information, and that accelerates our possibility of inventing and creating new kinds of things. And I will simply now talk for a few minutes, about stage 1, and then what we'll focus on is mostly stages 2, 3, and 4. And then at the end of my talk, I'll talk a little bit about my vision on the Industrial Revolution. So, what is this? Well, what we have, and we can demonstrate on the basis of the huge numbers of stone tools that we have all over the world, from about 2 million years ago to the present, we can show how it took most of that time for humans to get their mind around the fact that objects have 3 dimensions. And what we see is that the most primitive stone tools on the upper right, what people do with them is simply take a little chip off, a little point. And because of that, you can argue, quite coherently, that that is a 0-dimensional way of looking at those pieces of stone. What we then see as the next stage is that people start making a number of chips around the edges. So they're making a line. They're making something that is 1-dimensional. And ultimately, they go all around the stone, and they have thereby done something which leads to making a decision, which is creating a surface, creating something in 2 dimensions. And what we observe on the stone is that there are 2 ways of doing that. Some people will chip off all the edge and then hack off the middle, and other people will do the reverse. They'll hack off the middle first and then start chipping at the edges. So there is a conscious decision from that moment that you have to deal with 2 dimensions. Now, the situation after that is much more complicated, but what I'm going to argue is that the end of that event, let's say about 150,000 years ago, is that people begin to treat that piece of stone in 3 dimensions. They start cutting off one side, they're cutting off the top, and then they start making narrow blades from the 3rd side. And the nice thing about that is that you can actually get lots of them, and it then completely fundamentally changes the logic of why you do the stone napping. Because initially you do the napping in order to preserve and shape what is the core of the piece of stone. That is the tool that comes out of the process. At a certain point, though, you invert that, and once you start getting these blades off one of the sides, not only have you used the stone in 3 dimensions, but now it is what you take off that becomes the tool. And we suddenly get a very different kind of tools. So I'm simply giving you that example to basically say, okay, we have a very long-term evolution there, and we can measure all the steps in that evolution worldwide. It's not always going at the same speed, it's not always going exactly the same way, but globally, that process takes us a long time. And so, okay, that is the very first step. We have only by that point got an idea that you have 3 dimensions on a piece of stone, which of course always had those 3 dimensions. But what I'm accentuating here is that's a question of bending the brain around the situation. And I think that is what drives a lot of this. This is the result. On the top left, you see one of those very, very early pieces of stone. And on the bottom right, you see how people begin to control the shape. And the controlling the shape is also a question of controlling the scale. Because what they do is they first take off big chunks, and then smaller and smaller and smaller chunks, until they actually, the chunks they take off are so small that they don't hit them off, but they actually rub them off. So what we begin to see is a whole scala of scales at which people start distinguishing things and understanding them from the very large to the very small. Now we get to this stage number 2. And I think the important part there is that we have reached what in technical terms is called a short-term working memory, STWM, of 7 or 8. Now, there's a long argument about that, but let me first explain what we're talking about with this short-term working memory. Take a chimpanzee. He will be able, at least some of them, and not all of them, are actually able to crack a nut. They have an anvil, they have a hammer, and they have a nut in between. And they control, in their short-term working memory, the relation between those three sources of information. At the end of that evolution, and I cut out all the slides that give you the proofs and everything else, but we actually can handle 7 sources of information. You only have to look at the man on the fair who holds 7 balls in the air at the same time, which otherwise you couldn't do. So we have all kinds of indications there that at the moment that we deal with 7 sources of information, we're at the level where we are more or less at present. And that has also a correlate in the proportion of brain mass to body mass, in the age by which human beings become adults, because it turns out that this capacity to integrate more sources of information actually stops by the end of adolescence. So let's leave it at that for a moment. Let's now look at what happens when we get to this stage. And we get then, for the first time, the importance of communication. The communication story is the story that Brian referred to in terms of printing. But that's only a very late stage. What we see around this particular period is that by talking to each other and having larger groups of people interacting, there is a wider range of dimensions that the group can actually begin to think about. And so we get all kinds of differentiation. We get new sorts of artifacts, and I will show you some in a moment. But we also see that around that time, groups of people are migrating into climates where they never were able to be before, like the Arctic. And that is possible because together they actually develop new technologies that enable them to survive in those kinds of climes and in those kinds of environments. So there's a shift to collective learning by human interaction, in which communication becomes important. I would argue not that that is the time of the origin of language, which is a very hotly debated topic, but at least we can say that at that moment language becomes essential to human further development. What we see materially is a huge explosion of new inventions. And the question then becomes, well, what drives those? And as I have just said, I personally think that it is the fact that people start interacting with each other. Then you have the question of why did it take so long for that to take off? And that is what I tried to at least point out by pointing to that long term it took for humans to actually get to understand the world in 3 abstract dimensions. What you get from that moment is that different groups in different places interact much more between themselves than with others. And so you get cultural differences. These groups develop on their own different ways of acting, different ways of dealing with the environment, different foods to eat, different ways to build shelter. All those things begin to emerge around this particular time if you look at it from a global perspective. But what I want to accentuate before we get there is that what is at the root of this is also the development of a whole set of tools for thought. And those are here. One of the things that is necessary for all this to happen is that human beings can distinguish a reality from an idea. They need to be able to observe a sequence of actions, store those ideas, and then invert that sequence to actually start imitating the original achievement. That basically means that part of what our brain from that moment is all about is interacting between the reality and the conception. That also means that from that moment on, we can actually begin to put alternatives in place in our minds, which until then we couldn't, because we could not distinguish between the reality and the conception. What we see at the same time is the ability of people to categorize and to sort stones, for example, into things that are likely to be the same or others that are different. What we see also is that feedback becomes important. And that's a technical issue that you can demonstrate on the stone tools, because what you can actually see is that people start taking the end product into account in early stages of manufacture. So they have different cycles that are embedded in each other where they actually start thinking. We get, and I already talked about that, size hierarchies from large chips to very small grains that they take off. But what we also see is, and this is a strange word which is very rarely used, but the relationship between the whole and its parts starts changing. And I demonstrated that, or I argued that, by pointing to the fact that initially you take off all kinds of things to create the whole that you're using, and that after the change, when we have the blade industries, you actually see the reverse, and we use the small parts and no longer the whole. A last thing that I'll point out too is the fact that around this time, or a little bit later, we are able, as human beings, to translate a three-dimensional observation into a two-dimensional image. And that is what images like the cave images, like Lascaux and so on, are all about. The sequentiation and anticipation is another aspect, but there are many, many more. All I'm trying to show here is that behind these early steps in technology, what we actually have integrated is that our mind has gotten a new, different set of tools for thought, a different set of operations that it can actually take on board. Now, let's also for a moment look at this collective element that I mentioned earlier on. And I think what the fundamental driver is about the loops between people and the environment is that they also determine the cognitive development. Let me simply say how this goes. As a human being, you're faced with a situation that you don't know. It's all new. What you start doing after a little while is you start beginning to categorize. You start beginning to solve some problems that you see in that environment. Now, the fact that you begin to solve those problems enhances the number of tools for thought you have. So you actually, the problem solving itself structures knowledge. If you have more knowledge, you see more problems. So you have increasing information processing capacity, and that allows you to see new data, new problems, and that creates new knowledge. That is the cycle that I see as the driver at the individual level in us. But at the collective level, there is a little twist to that, because there are limits to the individual information processing. So after a while, we start talking to our colleagues when we don't know anymore what is happening, and so we begin to involve more and more people. When we involve those people, we get a larger group size of interactivity, and we have therefore also an increased information processing capacity. But it also means that because we have more people, we have to get more energy and more matter out of the environment. That in itself requires more information processing. So once we go from the individual stage to the collective stage, this immediately involves growing populations and growing amounts of natural resources that we need to gather to keep the society alive. Okay, now let's look at the situation around 25,000. We then still have very small but intensively interactive groups. What we begin to see in technology is that people are beginning to make composite tools. They're taking a piece of wood, they're putting small pieces of stone with a very sharp edge into that and fix it with bitumen. That is a much more complex way of making tools and we've seen so far. We are also seeing very new materials. We're seeing bone being used, human bone and animal bone, for example, for these fish hooks. We see in the relationship to the environment a sort of ambiguous situation. Because some groups find and identify and develop the technology to exploit particular ecological niches, and so they start living off those niches and reducing the mobility that we have seen so far by hunter-gatherers and other groups that were really roaming over very large spaces. So we also begin to see with that, that's the counterpart of it, a specialization in subsistence strategies. Some people eat elk, other people eat some other animals, some people live off salmon on the northwest coast in the United States, for example, and so on and so forth. So that means that those people also begin to develop a sense of specific risks that are tied to what they're actually doing. We get back to those risks in a little while. But what it also means is territorial circumscription. There is a wonderful book, it's in a pocket, by a man called Hugh Brody, and it's called Maps and Dreams. And he describes, he was sent out to Western Canada as part of the Trans-Canada Pipeline, because he was asked to identify the territories of the different tribes. And he finds out that that's virtually impossible, because what they do is they have a particular area that they use, but the limits are not clear limits. Nevertheless, what he can see is that you get, between the different groups, linguistic and spatial differentiation, in the sense that people don't incur on each other's territory anymore, and people start differentiating the speech that they actually have. So that increased communication is an important part of that stage. I'm going to the next stage. I'm now at about 10,000 or 8,000 BP, and I begin to see societies who are settled, who are not in any way roaming around anymore, but also societies who are not dependent on an occurring wild set of foods, but who produce their own foods. That is what we call the Neolithic revolution. Now, there's lots of people who actually argue that that is a question of the Holocene coming, climate becoming more stable, and the environment therefore enabling this. I would argue that this again is also a conceptual change, that there is a very different set of ways of interacting with the environment. I'm here just giving you some examples of the kinds of tools that emerge and monuments like Stonehenge, but let's look at those dynamics. Until that moment, humans had basically harvested in the environment. They had taken what presented itself as ripe and ready to eat or to use. What we get at this point is that people start intervening in the environment. People start planting. They start clearing fields. They start focusing on particular foodstuffs that allow them to do that. So what we see is a very different, huge step, a very different interaction with our environment, which ultimately leads us to mining and things like that much further down the line. But it is that mental step of no longer only reacting to the environment, but also proacting into the environment that is important here. Now, any intervention in the environment or in society has unintended consequences. You know, we don't predict exactly how things will come out. We don't do that for inventions, we don't do that for our interaction in the environment. I'll come back to that in a moment because it plays an important part in the second half of my story. But I just wanted to point out that from this moment on, we don't control everything anymore. And that what we also see is that when we intervene in the environment, we actually trigger some of those unintended consequences, but at temporal scales that we cannot observe. So rather than deal with what we know and where we change what we see around ourselves, we actually do change that, but in doing that, create unintended consequences that may play out 30 or 50 years later. And in a modern example, which I cite very often for my students, poor old Henry Ford, when he created his first car, never imagined what it'd be like to have 3 billion of them on Earth. Those kinds of things become really, really important. So, what people start doing to reduce that risk is to simplify the environment first. So they clear fields, they take out all the trees, and they start planting one particular crop rather than a mixture. They differentiate space as part of that, because those fields and those houses which they also start building are actually dedicated space for particular activities. As part of that whole process, we get more and more group growth, we get more and more collaboration and communication, but there's a huge cost, and that is the cost to keep everybody happy. Because social conflicts and social problems are now becoming more and more important relative to environmental problems. That was mostly what we were dealing with up to that moment. And so we have to maintain more and more investment to keep the society functioning. And those are other kinds of inventions that emerge from this period onward. And part of that leads to the invention of institutions and sets of social rules that we have to obey if we're not going to be thrown out of the society. Part of the material manifestations that we see, let's say, 5000 BC, is that we move from villages to what you could call towns or cities. Now that distinction is in our conceptual minds an important one, but in the reality it was not at all. It simply meant that the sedentary groups of people that were already living in small settlements actually grew much larger settlements. More and more people, because of that dynamic between information processing, getting more people involved, having more problems, and therefore developing new technologies, actually also leads to the infrastructure that people are dealing with. And what I show here are simply some examples. Çatalhöyük is a major excavation in Turkey, which is demonstrating a lot of this. You see down below on the left-hand side Teotihuacan, because this is independently happening in many different places. In the Near East, in Mesoamerica, in the Far East, in India, and places like that. So all of those places have their own path-dependent developments that at a certain point lead to the need to bring more and more people together and therefore lead to towns. But the towns are not the only thing. What we know from the archaeology is that at the same time that we develop the towns, we actually develop a whole series of new tools. The second image there is a tablet in which those impressions indicate a number of something. I have found some myself in the Near East, and they can be sheep, for example. Why would they be in existence? Well, there is a beginning of trade, because these towns are spread, but they come out of more or less the same period. And so you would see somebody who owned a bunch of sheep wanting to offload them to another town. So he would send a shepherd. But who knows how many sheep the shepherd would sell on the way? And so what you get is these clay documents that are fired and therefore unchangeable, and that record, in one way or other, how many sheep were on the road. What they do ultimately, and I didn't have enough place for these images, is to actually envelop that clay tablet and have the message on the outside as well as on the inside, so that the shepherd himself could keep control over how many sheep he had by looking at the outside. And the person receiving it would break open the envelope and would actually then look at the inside whether that is the right number. Out of that comes writing. Out of that comes the need to have clerks, like down below. Out of that is the administration that is being built up. On the right-hand side, it's the first laws that we know of by Hammurabi in the Near East. But we also begin to get systems of weights and measures. So what you begin to see is a whole set of tools to facilitate the interaction between people by standardizing some parts of that interaction. That is, I think, what is crucial about this particular stage. Now, urbanization is very costly in energy. If you have a group of 500 people, you can eat off the land immediately around. If you have a group of 50,000 people, you have to go a lot further afield to actually get the energy that you need to feed everybody. So I would argue that towns are driven by the need for problem solving and information processing, and that they are constrained in size by the need to get all the energy to keep people alive. So energy does not create cities. And cities save energy, that's true, but it's not the driver. It is the need to solve problems that drives that aggregation. And so what I imagine, and this is completely abstract and has no immediate proof in reality, is that what you get is two different flows. One flow from the center of the city outward to actually transform the environment and exploit the resources of the environment that then are being brought back in. So you have an outward flow of information, of organization, and an inward flow of energy and matter. But to keep those flows going, innovation is fundamental. Because once you don't have anymore the attractivity in the center of keeping all those people together, they become totally disinterested. And so the society falls apart. That is what I've tried to put here in this image, which I'm not going to go into any real detail, but simply to give you a visual image to go with the fact that this information flow structures both the environment, but also the society internally. And so what we get is a potential in information from the center to the periphery, and another potential in energy from the periphery to the center. Now, one important part of that is that I argue that we need to change our own thinking about situations like that. And that is that last phrase on this particular PowerPoint. And that is that in our society, we very often think of what happens as stability is the norm and change needs to be explained. That is a Platonic idea, but I would argue that that actually may not be such a useful idea. I would argue that at least what we need to do is also do the inverse and say, okay, change can be happening at any time. Everything changes all the time, but humans are the ones who try and create the stability of a society by inventing artifacts, by inventing institutions, by inventing behaviors and imposing those. So that, I think, is a lesson for us in the present, because as Brian has argued very nicely, from up till about 1700, 1750, our societies basically did not really have a vision of the future and change. Stability was in those days the norm. But now we're in a very different situation, and we need to play these two different kinds of perspectives on the relationship between change and stability. Okay, a last bit of theory, and then I'll let you guys go, okay? I think I talked earlier about these risks, and about the fact that what is important is that when we act in everyday life, we change risks, and we end up with these long-term risks that create problems for society. That is what, in a lot of scientific language nowadays, is what we call the tipping points. What I'm arguing is that as we take out those shorter-term risks and we insert in the society the longer-term risks, it is because of the limitations of that short-term working memory that I was talking about earlier. You know, when we act with the environment, we see about 7 or 8 dimensions individually, and maybe 20 or 30 collectively, of a particular set of dynamics. We take that simplified idea, we begin to elaborate a solution, and then we confront that solution with the world outside. But the world outside has many, many more dimensions. So what we're basically doing is we're only changing a very little part of what is going on, and we have no idea what else we are changing. And that is, I think, the fundamental dynamic that brings us to this difficulty of tipping points, of the fact that, as we see now, sustainability is an issue that we need to change something. It has driven us, our behavior in the past, to a point where we can no longer control what is happening, and we need to really fundamentally change our thinking. Okay, we were at towns. The next step of towns is a really simple step. They start controlling and needing more and more energy and resources from the environment. They start controlling other cultures. And a great example of that is China, is Rome, is the Persian empires, and so on and so forth. So what I am arguing here is that those organizations, they sort of are enabled by centuries beforehand, culture beginning to change on their own periphery. And I'll give you an example that is typical for me, and it's a letter from Caesar when he is conquering Gaul. He begins with lots of optimism, and he beats all kinds of chiefs and conquers cities, towns. And then he comes to Belgium, and he tears his hair out. He says, "Here I am a Roman general. And with my army, there's nothing I can try and beat or conquer, because there is no structure. There is no generals, there are no chiefs, there are no fortresses, there is no army. Why the heck am I here?" And what I'm arguing with that is that what you see progressively around the Mediterranean is how the Roman Empire actually is only going to the limits of where other societies have organized themselves beforehand. And they cannot go beyond that, because then there's nothing to conquer. And so that is the limit for the Roman Empire, and we know that. Another aspect that is important there is the role of power changes once we get these kinds of very large structures. You know, power is something that enables. We have the power to do something, but at a certain point, with hierarchies, we begin to get people who actually control power. They have power over people, and they start slowing down innovation. That is another aspect of this longer-term dynamic. Just a quick image of Rome. On the one hand, the growth of the Roman Empire. Next to it, the fact that it's held together by all these beautiful roads that they build, and which some of them are you can still drive on them. I have done that at some point. But then also how over the whole of Western Europe we get these villas, and a villa is not what it is now, but it's a huge agricultural enterprise that exploits the land for the Romans. And they then take those crops and whatever is in the yield, they transport it to Rome, because there they have a few 100,000 people who have nothing to eat. And so part of that also is that slaves begin to do the work. And I want to go back one moment to Brian's example of the steam engine, because there is a classic moment in the history of the Roman Empire where in Alexandria people had invented steam engines. And they then went to the emperor and they said, what can we do with this thing? This is a fantastic new source of energy. And the emperor said, I don't need it, I have slaves. With that, what I want to argue is how important it is that an invention actually, to some extent at least, has a society that is ready to receive it. And I think that's an aspect that we see also in the present day in lots of different ways. And I saw part of the exhibit downstairs, and I think there's a lot to be learned from that. So Rome collapses. Rome creates an information infrastructure that is an army and an administration which becomes so expensive in energy cost that they can't maintain it. That basically means that the only way to deal with that, you don't have paper money or computed money, you just have coins. So what do? Is you put more and more bronze in them and less silver. Well, that is what this graph shows. It basically shows the value of Roman coinage as a result of inflation, because they cannot deal with their situation anymore. Now, I'm going to give you another example. I have, I hope, a little bit more time. Where are we, Jan Wouter? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to focus on one particular example of technological change which has completely changed every aspect of society. And I'm doing that to take an example from the Netherlands, the way in which the Dutch have created their own western part of the country and how that process has worked. And why I'm doing that is because usually we talk about problems creating solutions. I am talking about solutions creating problems, because that is the other side of that cycle, and I think it is a very important driver of the kinds of evolutions that Brian has talked about. In this particular case, we have an interface between the sea and the land. Land is about 10 centimeters higher than the water table. So land needs to be protected and to be exploited. And what we will begin to see is that how that exploitation completely degrades. What we also see is that then there are institutions created, and those institutions are undermined by the people that should be behaving according to those institutions. And in all of that, the technology is the crucial element that keeps that whole system together and forces the conditions that it creates itself, force it to change the technology. And I think that is the important part. Let me give you a bit of the details. The first thing you see in this particular part of the world is from the 12th century. The normal mouth of the Rhine River, the one that is a big river through Western Europe, can no longer go into the North Sea because a sand current has blocked it off. That means that behind that sand, you actually get a marsh, a huge marsh. And so the people are getting very unhappy because they're getting wetter and wetter, and they don't know what to do with that. So the first thing they do is very interesting. They have political units, they have little chiefs everywhere, but those chiefs fight. But of course, water is not something that you can deal with only in one location. You have to deal with water over the whole surface. And so what they do is they create new institutions that govern the water, and only the water, but over the whole area, and all these little counts and dukes, they have to be subjected to this new authority that is created. And so what we see here is the map of how that authority changes and begins to create, on the right-hand side, not only new institutions, but then also dams and sluices and all kinds of ways to manage the water. So again, institutional development and technological development go hand in hand, and I think that is the main message that I have there. What you then begin to see is that when this land was still relatively high, you could have cereal on it, for example. But because it's peat, and peat diminishes its thickness at the rate of about a meter a century, after a couple of centuries there isn't enough fertile peat left to keep growing all those cereals. So people start changing and they start growing cows on it. They are helped by that, and this is important, because from that moment shipping can bring in cereal from the Baltic all the way in Northern Europe. So there again you see the technology, the economy and the society interacting in a very closed way. After a certain time, the grain prices rise because the transport from Northern Europe is less interesting, so agriculture becomes important again. The only way they can do the agriculture in that area is by draining the water. And so you get a new invention, you get windmills all over. All the little red circles on that map are places where there are windmills from that moment. That works for a little while, very nice. But then again, you get cheap grain get imported. And milk products and meat get a higher price. That immediately changes the economy again. Until then, low local wages stimulated fishing, transport and trade. But also, because of the cheap wages, industry, and thereby the growth of the towns. Ultimately, the land surface is dug away. The land is no longer valuable, but it's only valuable as dried peat, because in this whole area there isn't a tree to be found. And all of the industry that is happening in the cities needs fuel. So farmers start basically literally digging away what was their area for crops and things like that. And the result of that is, of course, in a different way, and here are two images that have not come across on my PowerPoint because they came from somewhere else, but it's basically, we have maps from that period with inundations everywhere. You see how the land has become potholed with little lakes, and how those little lakes then inundate the land around, and so ultimately the whole land disappears, and what we have is a large lake. That's to be followed in a moment. In the meantime, we get a different development. We have initially people do these collective works that are necessary to maintain the environment on the basis of forced labor, at least not forced in the sense of the Lord says it, but forced in the sense they know they have to do it, so it's collective labor. But then, of course, the rich try and not do that, so they pay somebody else to go and do it. So little by little, that becomes a very different system. In one stage, once the farmers start digging away all of their own land, the authorities say, well, we cannot tax the water. So if you want to dig away your land, you have to first buy an equivalent amount of land somewhere else, then we can start taxing. But nevertheless, over time, what basically happens is that the authorities are getting a lot of trouble financially to maintain all the infrastructure. Some of that, in that process, what we see is some of that infrastructure is the locks that you see on the right-hand side of your image here. And on the left-hand side, one very important part that we'll get back to in a moment is a long dike, almost from what is now Amsterdam to what is now Haarlem, where they actually allow the water to go out when the Rhine has a lot of water, and they block the sea from coming in when the water is not so high in the center. The next stage of this, another really important stage, is between 1550 and 1660, the labor was still low. But then the price of food becomes important again. The land that had been made into lakes had to become land again. And so they started making a dike, a sort of a levee, around a piece of land that had become a lake. In that levee, they would dig a canal, and then they would use windmills to actually bring up the water into that outer ring around the area, and that way they would pump out all the water out of the lake. And as long as they kept the windmills going, and you would see very many windmills, that actually kept working. And what you see here is a reconstruction of how that actually works. Then we get a disaster. Another aspect of society begins to play a role in the devolution of technology. In this case, that is a war. In 1672, the English, the French, and the Germans thought they had enough of the Dutch. They were too rich, and there was too much jealousy, so they attacked the country from every side. The only way the Dutch could defend themselves is by inundating the land around the cities. So in the end, those other nations did not conquer the country. But 3 years later, because the dikes had not really been maintained, there was a huge storm, and that ruined that famous levee that I showed you with all the little locks in it. That created yet another urgent situation, because the authorities that were responsible for the water could no longer in any way pay for the repair. What then happened is that the cities, realizing that this was also their stake, actually took over the paying for that levee. As a result, new powers were now governing that whole area. And the urban society, for the first time, became dominant over the rural areas. We come to the end of this whole story, okay? All of those lakes, when they were relatively small, could be drained with windmills. That worked pretty well. But there was one lake that they couldn't drain because it was too enormous. And that is this lake that I've showed here, which is actually under the current airport of Amsterdam. And what you see here on the right-hand side is that when the wind blows from the south to the north, the water is actually swept up by about 3 feet and overruns a lot of the land. And when the wind comes from the north, it's the same in the south. So this area becomes really, really dangerous. What we see then is an interesting twist to the Industrial Revolution. Around 1800, Napoleon conquers the Netherlands. He sends his brother out there to govern. He is kicked out in 1814. And at that moment, for the first time, the country unifies under a king. Until then, every area was independent. The king changes the system of agriculture in the Dutch East Indies and creates a huge new resource stream. He becomes very rich. At the same time, the steam engine comes in and actually makes it possible to drain this lake at a very high cost, but with only 3 steam engines. And it takes a while, but it is dry, and it is dry to this moment. Okay, last stage of all that, and I don't know what happened, but a number of my images have not come across, is that Holland tries to do this also everywhere else. And that works for a while, from about 1920 to about 1960, but then the European Union comes in. And that means that the cereal that was going to be cultivated in all these new dried up lakes is no longer needed. So they actually stop that whole process of creating more and more land. And so that is sort of the story of how I think technology is sort of like, I don't know whether you know that, but in fairs, sort of village fairs and commercial fairs, you had these steps that were going up and down. and you would climb on one step and it would go a little bit up, and then you would climb on the other one and it would go a little bit down, and you had to clamber up like that. And I imagine that technology actually, in many ways, does exactly that. So in that process, the interaction between institutions, geography, technology, everything else, economy, but also the interaction that we get these institutions, for example, the institutions that govern the water situation in the West, and then the individuals who start doing things that go against that and that fundamentally undermine the institution. Then they create a new institution, and other people will undermine that institution. So I'm simply sort of trying to relativize what Brian's focus was really on the technology and on the science. And I would argue that this is part of how that whole society actually evolves. Okay, I'll leave that. In the end, and you were and did talk about that at great length, I just want to show a couple of other parts of that story. Around 1750, when fossil energy gets discovered and gets harnessed over the next century, we see this huge explosion in energy use. An individual, for his own well-being, can survive about at 100 watts. Right now in America, every individual uses 11,000 watts. All of that goes into infrastructure, but not only roads and houses, also the maintenance of the administration, of the tax system, of the legal system, and everything else. So we see that after that moment, and you have shown beautifully, Brian, from the inside how the thinking changed, but you see also how the circumstances change, and that gets me to this very well-known image, which is the image of all that after 1750 start changing. Not only the number of McDonald's, but also energy use and just about everything else about society. So we get this thing that in sustainability science we call the Great Acceleration. And that is, for me, the end of this story. I just want to go back to the image at the beginning, which shows all these things that I have been able to experience and how I think the tools for thought that we have developed for society and in society over a long time have enabled those kinds of things. Thank you very much.